All right, so we're going to talk about coloring and shading and our designs, and thinking also about line weight. As we're drawing these, we can also think about the line weight we bring into the design. Now we can keep everything the same weight, and that's definitely one direction we can take. But I wanted to point out that you can also, we're going to be working in threes, that you can also think about line weight. Here's an example of the three different line weights: a light, a medium, and a heavy. Now, for example, in this scenario, the heavy line is only used to outline the entire element, the entire object. So here for this blender, you can see that the heaviest line weight is an outline, kind of highlighting the entire shape. And then there's two other line weights to indicate different elements. So for example, there's a medium line weight that's being brought into some of this decorative detail down here in the buttons and in the patterning in the front of the blender. And then the light line weight is pretty much used for the entire glass jar and the entire structure. And where they wanted to show a little, like the shadow side, they used the more medium weight line. And for the more highlight side, they were using the lightweight. So that is something you can also think about, if even just using two different line weights, where you're using one line weight for the whole thing. But if you have a design that you want to kind of pop out of the background, you can create an outline around the entire thing with a heavier weight to kind of bring attention to the actual outline of the design. So that's one thing to think about with just the line weights. All right, let's talk about shading. And I'm going to bring in some pictures of just houses. Move this guy down, move down, move down. Okay. So here, I want you to see some of the shading. So we're looking at, you can see where the light source is. And even though each one of these buildings is a different color, they're all working in each different design has, each color has three variations. There's a light, a highlight, a medium, and a dark. So for example, the green on this building, this is the light sources to the left. So notice that the light is consistent through all the buildings. Here's the highlight side, the highlight side, the highlight side, highlight, highlight, highlight. And also I want to point out that, for example, here's the shape of these shrubs. So notice how these shrubberies, and a lot of you have shrubberies, they can be made out of like blocky shapes. And then there's a shadow cast from this tree onto the building, because again, the light source is in front. So if you have an object in front of something, there would be a shadow. And so lighting is really important to help give us that dimension. Notice also on the roof line, there's a shadow that's been added along where the objects, if this is the front, then there would be casting a shadow. So cast shadows are going to be really important when we're bringing in that light source. So you might have elements that shadow, and you're going to keep that shadow within your grid as well. Notice how it's following the grid lines as it would in the isometric grid. But each color has three versions. There's the highlight color, the shadow color, the midtone color. I'm sorry, the shadow color and the midtone color. And so you're getting those different elements throughout. You're in the brown of the trim, highlight, shadow, highlight, shadow, midtone. So looking at all of those different elements, I know a lot of talk has been about like plant life, creating different layers of your shrubs. So like, for example, these are bushes, but notice how they're not just a block. There's two layers to kind of add a little more depth to make it feel like foliage. And the same with the tree. It's not just a solid block. It's kind of given you a couple different highlight, shadow, highlight to bring in the shapes. And they've even cut out little pieces of the blocks to make it look like shrubbery. It's still within the pixelated version, but it's not a solid shape because shrubs have leaves and texture. So looking at some of these examples, you can really see how they're just kind of giving it an uneven edge to kind of help with the feel of shrubbery in these. And this is a lower res image. That's why you're seeing kind of a little pixelated more than it would be, as I'm showing it to you so big, and it's a lower level piece. Also, the depth of windows is a good one to be aware of. And when you're building in windows, giving the window a ledge and a shadow, a midtone, and a highlight so that it has some depth. So it doesn't feel like it's flat against the wall. It feels more structural. It feels more like it has presence. Here's an awning and the idea of a highlight happening on the awning. And the highlight changes to a midtone when it goes into the shady side of the building. So it's a highlight here, and both the awning and the highlight change to a midtone and a darker tone when it goes over to the shady side of the building. The other thing is remembering to stay consistent in when you have multiple buildings, and a lot of us have multiple buildings, that all the buildings stay at the same lighting source. And it's better to have your lighting source on a side versus the top. I would avoid having your lighting source be the top of the object. It kind of works better when your lighting source is the side of the building. And if you have questions as we're going, feel free. Let me open the chat. I don't think I have the chat open. Hold on a minute. So if you guys are saying something, I don't see it. Okay. So, and feel free to turn your mic on if you have a question. Okay, I'm going to pull in another. I'm going to show you a nighttime scene. So this one I think is interesting because it's also showing, you know, at night there's not, you know, what's the light source? Well, in this case, it's kind of showing lights kind of coming up out of the buildings. Like, how are the buildings lit? The buildings still have 3 different colors. So here you have this one, it does have the highlight at the top because it's kind of moonlit, right? I guess. So here you have the highlight color at the top, a mid-tone on the left side, and the darkest tone on the right side. So it still is giving dimension to each building. Mid-tone, darker tone, highlight. And the highlight stays constant on the top because it's coming from the top, as if it was the moon. So those are some things to think about. But then the idea of adding light, if you're doing a more nighttime scene, you know, how do we add the glow of lights coming in? And so you can see this one has kind of these light elements kind of been added. Okay, so let's go over here to our cube. So very basic, I recommend as you get into designing, I'm going to show you something to think about when you're designing. Let's say you have, you're choosing your color. So let's say I'm going to choose, let's try blue. I'm going to choose blue. And I'm going to make a copy of my blue and then pick what's my darkest color. And what can be an easy way to get your mid-tone, if you're like, okay, I want to go from this blue to this blue, and I want to get a mid-tone. Here's an example that we can use our blend tool that we've used. So we can go up to Object, Blend, and go to Blend Options. And I can go Specified Steps, and I can say 1, and say okay, and go Object, Blend, Make, and then it gives me my mid-tone between these 2 colors. Now, if you want to have something even a little bit more complicated, we could say, or more in the bigger range, because we have maybe awnings or some other elements. So we're going to need more than the 3 colors if we want to get more of a blue palette. And oops, no, I don't want to do that. I got to expand this. Sorry, I forgot to expand this. So once you've done that, you want to go object, blend, expand. So they're separate pieces again. Okay, so I'm going to copy this blue again. And this time I'm going to say, I'm going to pull it out further and go object, blend, options. I don't want it to be a step. This time I want it to be, so I want 6, 4. So I want 4, total of 4. Say okay, object, blend, make. Okay, now I have, more steps. So if I have, for example, I want to do a lighter building and a darker building or darker parts. I have multiple facades on the darker side. So I could work with maybe these 3 for my darker, or these 2 for my darker, these 2 for my lighter, and these middle 2 for my midtones. So there's options. But the blend tool can be a really great way to make these palettes of the 3 colors you want, or if you want to go more extensive. So that's something to consider to help you make your palettes for your different colors. So that I can just want to make sure that whatever I'm doing, I'm choosing to make my cubes consistent. I'm going to hide my guides so you can see this. So the idea of now, if I had another element that I was adding, right? So let's say I have another element that I'm going to add on this side of my cube. I could then make it in that darker zone. So that's how I would use multiple darks if I have another element and I want to keep it in that darker tone. And then let's say there's an element of it that has a little highlight. I can then bring back my highlight, say that I'm, seeing the highlight. And then I would make a darker shadow for the bottom. So it's just kind of like, how do you, when you're building in and making things like windows. And so then blah, blah, blah. Here, I'd probably grab my mid-tone and I'm bringing in the bottom. So anyway, that makes sense? I have to change my earbuds for a second. And I'm going to just check in and see how we're doing. I'm going to stop share for real quick.